कर्माणान प्रजया धनेनात्यागेनैके अमृतत्वमानशुः परेण नाखं निहितं गुहायां विभ्राजते तद्यतयो विशन्ति वेदान्तविज्ञानसुनिश्चितार्थाः संन्यासयोगाध्यतयः शुद्धसत्त्वाः ते ब्रह्मलोके तु परान्धकाले परामृतात् परिमुच्यन्ति सर्वे दह्रं विपापं परमेष्मभूतं यत् पुण्डरीकं पुरमध्यसर्गस्थं तत्रापि दह्रं गगनं विशोकस्तस्मिन् यतन्तस्ततुपासितव्यम् यो वेदादौ स्वरप्रोक्तो वेदान्ते च प्रतिष्ठितः तस्य प्रकृतिलीनस्य यः परः स महेश्वरः ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. Thanks for joining us. So the idea of giving this teaching about yoga came a few years back for me. I think it was about 3 years ago. I don't have a very good sense of time. A student of mine, at that time I had agreed to teach a little bit of Ayurveda for a yoga teacher training program, which I've done from time to time because I know a little bit about Ayurveda. And so this program was being run by one yoga teacher who was a student of mine, and I was giving her some help with writing some spiritual portions of the yoga teacher training program as well. And in those days, I would go sometimes to her yoga classes. She would ask me to come and to make some comments or whatever on the ways in which she was teaching and ways she could work more with the students and things like this. And when I would go there, she would be doing some of the practices as she was teaching the practices. And when I would go there, she would say it would feel different. The same practices that she was always doing were having some different sort of results. And often she would start crying as she was doing the practices. Maybe it was just bringing things up and clearing things out. And she suggested to me that based upon our conversations about yoga and the teachings I'd received from my guru and that sort of thing, that I should teach a yoga practice. And so about 3 years back, I told her I'd work on that. And so about 3 years later, this is the result of that we're starting this process of teaching yoga to people with this series of teachings on yoga. I want to talk a little bit about the source of these teachings, about my guru's lineage. A lot of people who've studied a little bit about yoga know Yoga Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras. Yoga Sutras is a short text, I think about 160 or 190 verses. It's quoted often, it's referred to often. Most yoga teachers now have some reverence for Patanjali. But Yoga Sutras is not necessarily very well understood by people teaching and practicing yoga. My guru is, who I learned these yoga practices from, is in the lineage of Patanjali. Patanjali's guru, Maharishi Nandinatha, was also the guru of my guru's 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 guru, Tirumular. Nandinatha, sage Nandinatha, sent out 8 students, sent them in different directions to teach Shaivism and to teach yoga. And two of the most successful of his students that we remember in history anyway, I can't say the others were not successful, but they went to places like China, and we don't necessarily have a history in China of a Shaiva tradition or a yoga tradition. And there may be in those places we don't know about, but definitely throughout the world there's a lot of knowledge of Patanjali and Tirumular. These two students went to South India and helped to establish some major temples there. And they're both buried, their samadhis are in these temples there in South India. As opposed to the very brief Yoga Sutras, Tirumular wrote 3,000, more than 3,000 verses in his Tirumantiram. So from studying that, more knowledge comes, whereas Patanjali talks about the basics, the philosophy, specific practices are talked about more in the Tirumantiram, whereas not many specific practices are addressed at all in the Yoga Sutras. And so from the teachings of that lineage, which have been handed down in an unbroken tradition, not just the oral teaching of doing the practice, but energetically the teaching has been handed down through that lineage. And so from that lineage I received these teachings. I'm not officially affiliated with that lineage at all. Nandinata Sampradaya it's called, and Kailasa Parampara. It's a different branch of the lineage of Patanjali. I'm not sure Patanjali has any successors, I don't know. Maybe there are some in South India, but I've never been aware of a living lineage of Patanjali, but this other branch of this same lineage is definitely functioning in Hawaii, and they have a living guru who they say is the living embodiment of Tirumular. You can see their website, www.himalayanacademy.org. So they're building a beautiful temple. They're based out of Hawaii now. They had been in Sri Lanka. And so from the teachings of my first guru, a lot of this knowledge came from my experiences also. When I was a child, I was having different experiences from other people. I was hearing and seeing people other people were not seeing around, spiritual beings, dead people, things like this. I was having experiences where I was leaving the body, going into deep trances and things like that. I recall in my childhood, sometimes I would be troubled by the ways people were behaving. I couldn't really understand the way people were acting. It didn't make much sense to me. And it was a troubling thing. I was having trouble to deal with people in the way that they are. And so I would just sit and focus on something I recall, and then I'd go into a deep trance and just feel a oneness with everything all around, and I'd be unaware of the people around. And what was going on there. I was just in a different state of consciousness altogether. Later on, I started doing a lot of spiritual practices, consciously, intentionally. In those days, it was just instinctive what I was doing. But later on, I started doing these practices as taught by my guru, and had done some intense sort of tapasya, you could call it, austere practices, austerities, spiritual austerities, you could say. In those days, I was, for some time I lived in a car here in Virginia. It gets very cold. If people in India are watching, they may not know, it gets below freezing. And so through the winter, I slept there just in this car with no heat. And in the summer, it would get very hot, and of course the car would make it hotter, and I'd stay in there. A lot of the time, I mean, I would get out and pray sometimes. In those days, for about 11 months, I fasted almost completely from food and water. And I would sit in this body of water that was very sacred to me. If I could get flowers or leaves, I would say mantras and offer it into the water. I would sit for 10 hours a day or more, just chanting the mantras in those days. And people didn't want to have much to do with me. They'd come and throw rocks sometimes. And so it was a process, I think, of stilling the mind and helping the mind remain still among these distractions in the world. in that time, I started to have even more experiences. My awareness expanded. And so from that experience, I'm teaching this as well. Practiced Ayurvedic medicine, giving herbs and dietary recommendations to people for about 15 years. I've taught and practiced Ayurveda almost 15 years. Helping people with a whole range of conditions: diabetes, schizophrenia, possession, arthritis, menopause, infertility, all kinds of things, all kinds of different conditions. And a part of that is sometimes recommending yoga practices, asana practices or pranayama practices. And so from the knowledge of Ayurveda as well, these teachings about yoga come. So that's just a little bit about the source of this. Since we're not sure if we recorded the last talk I gave, I'm going to go over again some of what yoga is. And Sid was not there, so Sid did not hear that. Yoga is very different than what we think of yoga today. Yoga was very different than what we think of today. Today, for a lot of people, yoga is a physical practice. But yoga was a practice for realization. From the Yoga Sutras itself, the first lines of the Yoga Sutras describe what yoga is very nicely, very, very nicely. These are very good lines. It says, Atta yoganu shasanam yogas chitta vritti nirodhaha tada drashtuh swarupe avasthanam vritti sarupya ittaratra. Now, instruction on yoga. Atta means now. Atta is also a prayer. A lot of the mantras will start Atta. Before they say a mantra, they'll say, Atta, I'm going to chant this mantra. Now I'll say this mantra. And so it implies a prayer to say that. In some of the shorter sutras, they'll begin it with Atta, rather than with a whole verse that's a prayer to God, to imply that it's a prayer. You know, that's one thing, is that the devotional aspect of yoga is very often taken out of yoga now, the way that it's taught. But if you really understand Patanjali, you see it's a very devotional text, a devotional approach. So now instruction on union. Yoga means union, so I'm using the word union for yoga here in this translation. Union is the restraint of the mental activity, vritti, is mental activity natural to the mind. Yoga is the restraint of the mental activity natural to the mind. If you really think about that, that's very meaningful, it's very telling. It's not our nature to practice yoga. It's natural for the mind to be doing something else. Then the observer abides in his own nature, saying we have a nature different than this activity of the mind. Otherwise, he is of the same form as the mental activity. And so that this is very telling. That's yoga in 4 lines. It describes basically the whole process. That's all you need to know. But the mind makes it very complex. That's why we'll talk a lot more about yoga. If you think about all those lines, it's very, very telling, very revealing about nature, our nature, and nature beyond. Otherwise, he is of the same nature as those activities in the mind. And people make those mistakes often. If they're feeling anger, they'll say, I'm angry. Feeling sadness, they'll say, I'm sad. It's an experience they're having that they're associating with it, and they think they are it, and they start to act angry, they act sad. They may yell at you because they're feeling anger. They become like these activities in the mind. So through the process of yoga, you don't change the impressions in the mind, you don't change the feelings or the thoughts that are there, but you change your association with it. You change the process the mind is doing from that. So it's very telling. We've got to know that union means something. What are we being united with? It's God, the divine. That's not a very popular word, I think, now for a lot of people, God. You can call it other things. Patanjali uses the word Ishvara, which it clearly means God in Sanskrit. It's a name of Lord Shiva. Patanjali says Ishvara. We could say the divine, we could say nature, whatever you want to call it, however you want to try to approach it, but the point of yoga is that everything is God. Everything in the world is God. Everything beyond the world is God. That everything comes from God. That in us is God, in everything else is God. And you look at someone else, and their soul is God, and their body is God. We may not see that. Within us, within each soul is God. It's the teaching of yoga, the teaching of the Tirumantram, that the jiva, the embodied soul, is Shiva, God. They have the word Atman, meaning the high self, the divine self. So yoga helps us to see that. But not just that, it's not something that builds up our ego. It's by setting aside the ego we come to the realization. A lot of people give importance now, in the New Age philosophy, they give importance to the desires of their ego. And they worship that, and they act as if they're worshiping a divine self. They don't see beyond those attachments. But as you start to see beyond your own attachments, you start to see the divine in everything else as well. In not just yourself, but in other people. Maybe easier to see it in other people first. But yoga is that process by which you can have that experience. It's not just a thought. That's one thing I like about yoga. In many religions there's a dogma, there's a teaching, you have to have faith, they say. This is the way it is. We don't know why, we can't explain it. We can't tell you why it's this way, but it is. So listen to us and believe us, have faith. I heard that a lot when I was a child, asking questions in my church. I said, well, I don't understand this. How is there one God, but he's also three gods? And the elders there would all say, well, we don't know, we just have faith. To me, faith started to become synonymous with just ignorance. When people said faith, it sounded like they were saying that they lacked knowledge or lacked wisdom. Or even that they lacked integrity, didn't have the integrity to consider the words they were saying before they would say it. I felt that way as a child. And unfortunately for me, in the Christian system, which now I can see is a beautiful system, which can lead people to the highest truth, something these New Age systems cannot do, the Christian system surely can do. Lead people to the highest light, the highest truth, because it was inspired by a fully realized saint and sage and God living on earth, Jesus. But I couldn't see that then. And unfortunately, in that system, there was no way for me to test what was being said to me. Yoga is a system by which you can, you don't have to take people's word for it. You can do the practices and verify. Is this true? Is this not true? Is God actually in me? If you have attachments in you, you won't see God. That attachment will block the vision. It will obscure the vision of the divine. And so if you have more attachments that you can identify, you've got to keep working to remove those. But eventually, as you remove those attachments within, you start to see things more clearly as they are. Your experience is not shaded by the thoughts in your mind and the feelings you're having. If you're angry, everything starts to look red. The world looks like an angry, violent place. But as you clear that anger, you start to see, oh, that guy's not actually so angry and violent. That was me. It was a reflection of my own self. So yoga is a wonderful system like that. It can go beyond religions, it's the practice of all the mystical traditions, but it's not a practice for everyone in the world. Not everyone is seeking something beyond the world. Some people, they want just a material experience, and yoga practice may not be the best for them because it will start to expand their awareness. But there are mystics in the Christian tradition, there are mystics, the Kabbalah, the Jewish tradition, and the Sufis, and the Islamic tradition, and for all of them the practice of yoga could be okay. But for others, the practice of yoga is not for everyone, necessarily. Unfortunately, people are trying to make the practice suitable for everyone, approachable by everyone. They take God out of it. Any concept that's unpopular, they just remove from it. And they try to make it sellable. They try to do a practice where something happens to people and they can feel something happening. They say, see, this is working on you, this is doing something. And they try to sell it, they try to explain it and sell it. What I said before, and I'll say again, is I looked at a very popular yoga organization's website. I don't want to name that organization, but it's one of the big yoga organizations in the U.S. One of the biggest, very representative of what yoga is becoming here now in the U.S. And I read their website in the section that said benefits of yoga. And it describes the benefits of yoga as that it relieves stress, it relieves pain, gives you better breathing, increases flexibility, it helps with weight management, it improves circulation, it improves cardiovascular health, it helps the person to remain present, it gives them inner peace. This is very different from the traditional practice of yoga. The benefit of yoga is you see the true nature. You get free from karmas. The genetics of your family that were binding you, they disappear. You no longer have to die of a heart attack when you're 50 years old because your father ate a bunch of fatty meat and stuff. You can get free from the genetics. You get free from all sorts of karmas, family karmas, and your karmas from past life. You mitigate these and you make a better future possible for yourself. But more importantly, your mind gets still and your awareness of nature and reality around you increases. You start to feel the subtle body. You start to feel what other people are feeling. You start to feel the feelings of inanimate objects and of animals and plants. And you start to see spiritual beings. And you start to more and more see yourself, which is divine, which exists throughout the universe. You give up the limited experience of I am this body, I am the mind. You start to gain the experience of I am beyond all of this. The people practicing this new type of yoga, they may get some benefits a little bit, but for all the work they're doing, their body is going to continue to age. People work on their body so much because they want to look young, they want to look thin, they want to look beautiful. They want to be stress-free because this means they'll be free from wrinkles and they look beautiful and young, but their body will continue to age. And the more that they work on this body, the more they get attached to the body, unfortunately. It doesn't change the fact that the body is aging and the body is going to perish. And if they're too attached to that body, then they'll have the sense that they're perishing along with the body. are not the body, we're not the mind. We are the soul, which has inhabited many bodies before this and will inhabit probably many more bodies after this. The more you associate with that soul, then it doesn't matter if the body is dying. It's like changing a coat. I changed into these pants because we'll do the asana practice later. And it makes it easier than the veshti that usually I would wear. And just like that, I'll change this body later. And the more I dissociate from the body, the more that's okay. Say, okay, yeah, I'll leave the body, I'll die, okay, great. Because I'm not that, I'm the soul. This is what yoga can help you to accomplish. You get a sense of who you really are. Your sense of enjoyment in life increases, it deepens. Your experience of who you are deepens, and your knowledge of who you are deepens. This is the benefit of yoga, which is not mentioned here in the description, in modern descriptions. The effects of yoga are also described in the older texts on yoga, like Yoga Sutras. They talk about siddhis, mystical powers, siddhis, that arise as you're doing the practice. So many texts talk about ashta siddhis, 8 mystical powers that arise from the practice of yoga. These are Anima, the power to make oneself as small as an atom. Mahima, to make oneself as large as the universe. Garima, the power to become very heavy. Laghima, power to become very light or even to levitate. Prapti, unrestricted access to all places. Prakamya, realizing whatever one wills. Ishitva, absolute lordship. And Vashitva, power to subjugate all or to control the elements. Swami Vivekananda talked about when you control the prana. I remember reading this many years ago, and I was impressed by this. If you control the prana, you control the mind. If you control the mind, you control all the elements in the body, the 5 elements, Pancha Mahabhutas, earth, water, fire, air, space. If you control those elements in the body, you control those elements in the nature. So Swami Vivekananda had said the person who has mastered the prana, the breath, through pranayam can control the movement of the sun and the stars, could stop the sun from moving if this yogi desired to do that. This is a power that could come as you're doing your yoga practice. This is not the way people are practicing now. So other powers can come. Some of those, these ashta siddhis may sound immense, great, beyond our understanding. It is difficult to comprehend perhaps for us. But they describe God as having the power of omnipotence, all power, omniscience, all wisdom, all knowing. So God has those powers, the human soul has those powers. And the human soul is all power, all knowing. We look outside for knowledge, but all knowledge is within us. If we can begin to see that. If all power is there, why couldn't a yogi make himself as small as an atom or as large as the universe? I remember experiences of being not as much aware of the physical body and more aware of other bodies, and the bodies getting big like the room and smaller and that kind of thing. That was alarming when I was having those experiences at first. Something that was not comfortable. The process of yoga is not always comfortable. As you start to become aware of deeper levels of who you are, it can be shocking and disturbing. Constantly, it's a process of relaxing into a greater experience of what's going on around you. So we do yoga now in a very different way often. I like the analogy one I heard recently one teacher give. He said the way people practice yoga is like they found an airplane and they didn't know what it was for. So they started trying to drive it around town like a car. But it was big and cumbersome to get around, and the wings were causing some troubles going around. So they took off the wings. They're driving it around like a car down the streets. Of course, the airplane doesn't get around on the streets as well. This was the analogy he gave for the way people are practicing yoga now. They're taking away parts of it they don't understand. They're using it for different purposes, and it's not as good for those purposes. I said recently, if you want to exercise, yoga is not very good. And I tell people that you can do this asana set and it will help balance your health, but then go get some aerobic exercise also. Because yoga traditionally is not an aerobic exercise. Maybe people practice it that way now, some. But even that, it's not the best sort of aerobic exercise. It was not created for that purpose. For strength also, it's not great. To impress people, it's not extremely impressive. A lot of people, I think they do yoga to impress people. If you want to impress people, there's athletics, acrobatics is much more impressive. Even for mental peace, maybe it's not the best. They say yoga will give you mental peace, relieve stress. Probably not as much as a nice walk in nature. Not as much as deep breathing into the diaphragm, diaphragmic breathing. The yoga asanas aren't going to be as good for de-stressing. It's okay, maybe best for that out of the things I've mentioned. Really what the yoga asanas were created for was to help a person to sit for their meditation so that they can continue on in that process of yoga to realization. So, if we hear stories of the saints, we hear descriptions of them having great powers. In all the different traditions, not just the Hindu tradition, there are stories of the Christian saints doing miracles, being in 2 places at a time. There's a lot of Christian liturgical words for all these things. Bilocation, they call it. The saint has the power of bilocation. And this kind of thing. And these, of course, are siddhis that the yoga shastras talk about. The Bhagavad Purana talks about other siddhis. Person starts to get knowledge of past, present, future. They can tolerate heat, cold, and other extremities. They start to know the thoughts of others. They can control the thoughts of others. They can control the actions of others. They can control fire, sun, water, poison. They can stop them from having their effects. One time I had a student, he was, this guy was very intellectual, smart guy. But being intellectual is often a terrible curse when you're doing a spiritual practice. If you're too overly intellectual, you will reason your way out of your practice every time. But this guy was, he worked at nighttime in a shipyard and had to walk a long way. The parking lot was far away, and he had to walk through this dangerous neighborhood in the night to go to his job. And there was a group of bullies who would come, and they were bothering him often when he would walk there to work. He was getting scared, and he spoke to me about it. He said, these guys are threatening me. I'm going to go learn the martial arts. I said, this is probably a bad approach. You're feeling threatened, and so they're threatening you. And then you're getting even more threatened, so you're going to go act like you need to do something to help yourself or save yourself, which really you don't have power to do at the end of the day anyway. You'll probably increase your fear by learning the martial arts. Meanwhile, if you just become comfortable with the situation, these guys will stop bothering you. And he said, no, you're talking spiritual concepts, and I'm talking about a physical situation in the world. And I tried to tell him, I said, the physical world comes from the spiritual experience. The astral body is the source. From the astral body, the physical body is created. everything in this physical world has its source energetically in a subtler spiritual way. But he was making a distinction. He said, no, that's a spiritual thing. This is a physical thing. This is a real physical threat, so I need to respond physically. And he wasn't getting it. I kept trying to explain that he was very upset and blaming them for his experience of fear he was having. And so I asked him, if I could have the matches, the lighter we were lighting lamps in the puja. And I took the lighter and I lit it and I put it under my arm. And after a while he was like, oh no, don't do that. He tried to pull my arm away. I had to fight against him to hold it there. And I held it there for about a minute and a half. And I said, look, see, it didn't burn me because I didn't believe that it would burn me. And I showed him and he was like, oh. I said, see, so if you do something spiritually, if you have something taken care of on a spiritual level, it won't affect the physical level. And I think he started to see more from that experience. Different powers come to people. They say people will become unconquerable as a siddhi, a mystical, a magical power arising from practicing yoga. Unaffected by hunger, thirst, other bodily urges. They'll start to maybe see things at a distance or through a wall, or hear things at a distance, moving the body or objects wherever. They can just think of the place and their body goes there. Or an object, they may just move it. Some saints in India manifesting, just give it to people as a blessing. Most saints don't do that kind of a thing. But one saint, he'd twist his hand, he'd give a gold watch to people and things like this. Most gurus would never do that because you get lines of millions of people and they're not necessarily interested in spiritual teachings. They want a gold watch. But yogis and saints can do this kind of thing. And anyone practicing yoga, it's very easy to move matter. But really, that hand is very good for moving matter. Why would you even want to do that? Why would you waste any energy or time trying to do something you could just very easily do? Feet can walk you right out the door. But I remember one time I was doing a lot of meditation in my place and not seeing very many people. Every now and then a guest would come unexpected. And somehow I'd always know they were coming and I'd make their type of tea they liked and have it ready for them when they came. When you do a lot of practice, you start to see beyond, what you normally would see, and it doesn't make sense to the logical mind. You can see around walls in some sense. You may not see it, but you feel it, you know what's happening or something. The yogi will gain whatever they desire. As soon as a desire comes for a yogi, they say it's fulfilled instantaneously. But the yogi's ego desires get less and less and less, and his desires become more like universal needs. What's good, what God would desire. That will make maybe more sense if you reflect upon that thought in time. The yogis can enter into another's body. There's stories and different traditions of saints and yogis like Shankaracharya leaving the body and entering into another body. The yogi may be able to die only when they desire. They can choose when they will die. One of my gurus lived for 600 some years, they say. He was waiting to find a suitable student to pass on some knowledge to that he had been taught so that tradition wouldn't die out. They can witness the gods and experience the pastimes of the gods. Their commands are unimpeded. They say that the things that the yogi says, it may be true and become true. For him to say it, that thing will begin to happen. But as these siddhis come, I'm listing all these things, not to say we should try to develop these powers. We shouldn't. Maybe in New Age philosophy and practice, there are practices to develop these powers, but in yoga, they're not practices to develop siddhis and mystical powers. We don't have meditations to open the third eye or to awaken the chakras and this kind of thing. It's all a practice directed toward realization. And as a byproduct of this realization process, powers may come, insights may come. But as they come, it's very important that we don't use those to get drawn back into the world. I have knowledge of what's going to happen now. Let me buy the winning lottery ticket or pick the winning numbers. Let me go and gamble. Someone who is not a gambler may become a gambler because he thinks he has some advantage now. The yogi may gain powers to heal people or to see things that's going to happen for them. I really think one reason there's so many saints and gurus in India and so few in the West is that we're not following this teaching here in the West, where if you start to gain these abilities, you don't use that, you direct that toward realization. In the West, we have a thought, oh, you have a gift and that's for healing people. And so we have a lot of healers. And there are a lot of faith healers. And we have a lot of palm readers and astrologers and fortune tellers who will try to predict the future. An astrologer traditionally in India doesn't predict the future. He helps the person understand why they're having problems and helps them get rid of those problems. He helps identify spiritual reasons they may be having the problems. He doesn't tell them your husband will die later. He doesn't say this will be a bad year for your career. If the person is having trouble in their career, they come to the astrologer and he gives them some mantra to do, he does some puja for them or something, and then they have a better career. But in the West, we sit here making predictions because the ego wants to impress people. We try to heal people, again, because the ego wants to impress people. So, a guru in India would always say, if you get the power to heal people, then don't do that. Use that to continue to heal your own consciousness until you realize God, until you're no longer bound by karma. Or that as you're acting, using these siddhis in the world for material purposes, you're in great danger of creating karma. More karma. And it will be 3 times as intense because you're using these spiritual powers that affect not only the physical realm, they affect the spiritual realm and the astral and causal realm as well. When I see people doing prayers to hurt other people, black magic sort of stuff, I tell them, whoa, be careful. I wouldn't do that. I'd say if you want to hurt that person, just take an ice pick, put it in his eye. That hurts a lot, but it's going to come back on you a lot less because you're affecting his physical body. From that level, they may get emotionally hurt too. I can't believe that guy poked my eye. But it doesn't affect his soul so much. But the prayers and mantras, it starts on the level of the soul, then affects the mind, then the physical body. It's always 3 times worse when people are doing this kind of thing, and so I warn people not to do that. We don't have the wisdom to be healing people. Maybe a guru can do that. Generally, a guru wouldn't do that. It just may happen sometimes by the grace, by the energy of God, presence of God there. But we certainly shouldn't do it because we don't have the wisdom to know when it should be done. We need to start seeing that everything is good. Everything is the will of God. Everything is perfect as it needs to be. Each person who is sick, each person who is suffering on account of not something they did in the past even, but something that they're doing now. If they're sick, they did some activities to get sick. They're doing them still and they're staying sick. If you take away that sickness, that doesn't help them to learn. It doesn't help them to heal. They'll get sick again because they'll still be doing the same activities. And so you're not really healing, you're not really helping, you're just proving your ignorance to try to heal people. Who are we to say that God's world is imperfect? Who are we to say that someone else is imperfect and they need healing? They are perfect as they are. One of my gurus, he had a heart attack He canceled his tour of the world because he had a heart attack. And people said, Swamiji, you've healed thousands of people. Didn't you know you would have a heart attack? He said, oh yeah, I know. He said, well, why didn't you heal yourself? He said, why should I heal myself? He said, touring the world is fun and a heart attack also is fun. Why should I heal myself? But this is so hard for us to understand this kind of thing. So I realized a while ago there was powers there that could heal people working through me. But I didn't want to use those. Once or twice maybe my guru said, do this, heal this person, help this person. And once or twice I prayed and people got better. There's someone with cancer, I was praying for them, I got diagnosed with cancer. But, I'm talking about these things, but we shouldn't even talk about these things, really. If these powers develop, and you talk to people about them, it will increase ego. And it will increase confusion, and it will get people thinking, oh no, I didn't have that experience. What's wrong with me that I didn't have that experience? A person who's having a deeper experience than you might start to doubt and question themselves because they hear your story and then they start thinking, why didn't I have that experience? For their sake, for your own sake, keep the stories to yourself. I don't tell many stories like this. I'm telling it a little bit now just to help people really understand there's a whole world beyond what we think of as yoga. But to practice this type of yoga, we've got to follow the traditional steps. We'll talk more about those next time. We've got to have a teacher. That's very important. In the Yoga Sutras, it talks about having a guru. That's something people often miss when they're reading or translating Yoga Sutras. We've got a problem, I think, sometimes when the first translation of a Sanskrit text comes, all the translators after that will read that. And they'll base their translation upon that. So a lot of the translations of Yoga Sutras is not necessarily based upon yogic knowledge, but based upon the knowledge of the first people who were translating the Sanskrit texts. In many cases, these were Christian missionaries. So we get different thoughts, different ideas. So Yoga Sutras, a lot of people say these lines in the first section of Yoga Sutras say, not being bound by time, God, Ishvara, is the teacher of the ancients. Saying that God is the teacher. And that's probably true, that's probably implied there, but Sanskrit can imply many things. In another text on yoga, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, it says God is the first teacher of yoga. God's voice is Om. Repetition of Om should be practiced with an understanding of its meaning. From that, the power of introspection comes and obstacles disappear. That's how this section of the Yoga Sutras is translated most often. It's very interesting when you read this same section with the knowledge of having read Tirumantiram, which talks about the Guru. It sounds very different. The word Guru is there. The word Guru is there in the Sanskrit. Many other, there are many different ways you can potentially translate these things. That's why, sutras, you need a teacher to help you to understand. It's like a poem that's easy to remember. It doesn't tell you all the details, but it may help you remember what you have learned already. It may help you call back to memory something that you've learned, but it won't teach you. That's not the purpose of the sutras. Unless maybe you chant it, and energetically it comes to you through the power of the Sanskrit syllables, the mantra. The way I've translated these same lines is, to attain knowledge of the ancient science of yoga, a spiritual master, a guru, must be found. This is needed to initiate the process of yoga. Om is the syllable which makes one fit for receiving instruction. Through the practice of repeating the pranava, Om, the guru is found. It draws the guru to a person, and the obstacles are removed. This also could mean the guru removes obstacles. The guru's presence in your life will remove the obstacle of ego. It will turn the consciousness inward, whereas the consciousness has been outward before. It initiates that process, is what this text is saying, basically. That the guru's initiation is necessary. And you see that in much more detail in the Tirumantram. It says very clearly, very explicitly, if you don't have a guru, the way you find the guru, chant Om, 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 and this will draw your guru to you. A lot of people say that Patanjali is not saying you need a guru, and they're teaching yoga without any connection to the higher understanding of the teachings and without the energetic initiation of a teacher. Any action initiated by the ego will lead to more ego generally. Even if you somehow learn the practices of yoga without a teacher, without a guru, maybe you have a yoga acharya, a teacher who knows how to teach the practices but doesn't energize that practice for you. If you learn those practices, you may get some slight benefits, but really to empower the practice, you need the presence of a teacher, you need the blessing, the initiation of a teacher. It's very important. This is something Patanjali was saying. It's something that we leave out because it's easier. The ego, the nature of the ego to preserve itself, to protect itself from anything that could challenge it or threaten it. Because everything that gives power to our divinity challenges and threatens the ego. It's human instinct, human nature to avoid these practices, and it's the process of yoga to retrain oneself against the human nature. We can gain control over involuntary muscles in the body. There are many stories of the yogis who have had control over involuntary muscles in the body. That's kind of what we do to retrain ourselves against the instinct of the mind and the body. But that instinct is so strong. What we do from the ego will bind us. But what practice comes from these saints and teachers will free us. So I'm very lucky, we're very lucky to have these teachings given to us by Saint Patanjali, the sage Tirumular, and all the gurus of the Nandinata Sampradaya, and all the other yoga masters and teachers and gurus and saints and other traditions who have taught us all these same things. Jesus was teaching yoga. All these different teachers have been teaching the same in different ways. But I think if you take anything from this talk, it should be that the energetic connection to one of these teachers is essential to initiate, to begin the process, the inner process of yoga. Until then, it's just talking, it's just thinking, it's not yoga. Hari Om.